This is a special meeting of the governing body of the Borough of Fairhaven. This meeting was called pursuant to the Video Public Meetings Act. Notice of this meeting is approved by resolution number 2020-34, advertised in January 19th issue of the Asbury Park Press. Notice was provided to the Asbury Park Press at 2 of Times, Red Bank Region, the Hub, on January 9, 2020, posted on the bulletin board of the municipal building, and posted on the borough's website. Allison, roll call, please.
Council members Banahan, Kristen O'Keefe, Koch, here. McHugh, here. Rodriguez, here. Sorensen.
Okay. Like a motion to pass resolution 2020-35 of executive session pending litigation. Motion. Second. Roll call.
Council members Koch,
yes.
McHugh,
yes.
Rodriguez.
Yes.
Okay. So now I need a motion to go into executive session.
We're good.
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, folks, we are going to leave it and go into an adjacent conference room, and we will be back certainly just before the 7 o'clock meeting. Okay? Will action be taken?
No, well, no, not tonight. We're coming back out in the public meeting.
We're coming back out of the
Make a presentation.
and make a presentation. There we go. Okay? All rise. Salute the flag. Now you see this, sir? Would you please lead us in the pledge of allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please vote on one side. Thank you. Before we open, we have to read the sunshine laws. This is a special meeting of the governing body of the Borough of Fairhaven. This meeting is called pursuant to the Video Public Meetings Act. Notice meeting is approved by resolution number 2020-34, advertised in the January 9th issue of the Asbury Park Press. Notice was provided to the Asbury Park Press at 2 of Times, Red Bank Green, the Hub, on January 9, 2020, posted on the bulletin board of the municipal building, and posted on the borough's website. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming this evening to discuss the Fairhaven Fair Share Housing Plan. But before we do that, we do have an auspicious occasion, a proclamation honoring one of our residents, Mr. Henry Stevens, who will be celebrating his 100th birthday on January 16th. Sir? And I'd like to thank the Fairhaven Fire Company for escorting Henry here this evening. So if you'd like, you can stay seated right there. And I'll commence, and then when I'm done, the fire company has a presentation, and the Foundation of Fairhaven has generously donated some Daisy chocolates that's helped celebrate Henry's birthday. Proclamation honoring Henry Stevens. Whereas Henry Stevens was born on January 16, 1920, and will celebrate his 100th birthday this year. And whereas he has been a resident of Fairhaven for 47 years and has raised 3 daughters and 3 sons. And whereas Mr. Stevens is a World War II United States Navy veteran who served on the USS Tuscaloosa during the war as Lieutenant Junior Grade. He was an engineer on board ship responsible for all the equipment on the vessel, making sure it functioned properly and supplied all the power needed to operate under combat conditions. And whereas Mr. Stevens received many medals and commendations while serving our country as follows: World War II Victory Medal, American Campaign Medal, Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, European, African, Middle Eastern Campaign Medal, Navy Occupation Service Medal, China Service Medal, Combat Action Medal, Honorable Service Lapel Philippine Liberation Medal, Distinguished Service Medal. Whereas he is a true representative of the greatest generation that ever lived. And whereas after the war he worked as a consulting engineer for a company that manufactures spare parts for the Navy, and later on in life as a quality control engineer for AMSCO and other companies. Now therefore be it proclaimed that I, Mayor Benjamin Lucarelli, and the Borough Council of the Borough of Fairhaven, on behalf of the residents and borough staff, wish Henry Stevens a happy and healthy 100th birthday, and extends its deep appreciation and gratitude for his many years of selfless public service. Henry.
We are so pleased to join with your family and friends in wishing you the very best on this special day. As a centenarian, you have witnessed so much throughout your life in terms of development, technology, social, and political changes. Those years of unique experiences have left you with much to be proud of, whether it was your service as an engineer on the USS Tuscaloosa, a Navy cruiser that President Roosevelt and other officials have often used for travel in the years before the United States entered World War II, or serving overseas in the U.S. Navy, ensuring the proper function of ships and supplying power units operate under combat conditions. You have committed yourself to fighting for our country and our freedom. The residents of New Jersey, as well as the rest of the United States, owe a debt of gratitude to all service members that their steadfast commitment and sacrifice humbles us all. As Governor and First Lady, we thank you personally for your service today and every day. You are an incredible father, grandfather, mentor, and source of strength for the many people who have encountered in life. We hope this special milestone is spent celebrating in the warm company of those who cherish you most and provide you with lasting memories. Again, happy birthday. Best wishes for continued health and happiness. Our very best, Bill and Tammy Murphy, Governor and First Lady of the State of New Jersey.
Everybody enjoy a daisy chocolate in honor of
You guys on?
we can have your 3 minutes for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your hospitality here. I appreciate your all gifts and giving me. Thank you.
You're quite welcome, Henry. The honor is ours. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thanks, John. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you all for attending this special meeting of the Borough Council of Fairhaven. For those who don't know, I am Mayor Ben Lucarelli. To my right is Councilwoman Megan Christopher-Keefe, Council President Susan Sorensen, Councilman Chris Rodriguez, Councilwoman Betsy Koch, Councilman Mike McHugh. We also have our clerk, Allison Cipriano, and members of our Mount Laurel Committee, were myself, Betsy Koch, Chris Rodriguez, Councilman James Banahan. Before he joined council, he stepped off the committee once he was sworn in. Todd Lair, also our president chairman of the Planning and Zoning Boards. Andrew Sobel, Mike Borneo should be joining us shortly. Teresa Casagrande and Rich Gardello. Our borough affordable housing professionals are Fred Heyer and Susan Gruhl, the planners, and then Michael Edwards Esquire, Surrey Edwards and Nolan LLC, Special Counsel for Affordable Housing. And before I turn this over, and we brief you on the information of our Fair Share Housing Plan, I'd like to say how very lucky we are in Fairhaven to have such remarkable talent in our residents that we can draw upon to gather and in a very detailed and deliberate manner go through the process that has brought us here today. And I would want to seriously thank the members of the Borough's Mountain Law Subcommittee. Their presence here this evening is testimony that we all work together in good faith to finalize a settlement agreement that we sincerely believe is in the best interest of our community. At this point, I would like to turn it over to our Borough Administrator to raise the tax agreement to begin the program.
Thank you, Mayor Burrell. I would like to begin this evening by recognizing the importance of this topic and the committee's interest in this topic. I want to keep in mind that when the committee worked together, we gave a great level of commitment and care to this process because we realized how important this was for our residents and to the borough. I would also like to thank Superintendent of Schools Sean McNeil and his staff and the Fairhaven Board of Ed for hosting us this evening. We have an excellent relationship with the Board of Ed and with my office with Sean's, and we thank them for their courtesy. I also think it's very important for the community to understand that the borough looked long and hard when we chose our professionals to deal with affordable housing. We have outstanding professionals in Hiram Rule who are out of Red Bank, and they understand Fairhaven and local issues here for us. And Mike Edwards is an outstanding young attorney. He's recently been named a partner in one of the top affordable housing firms and probably the most notable affordable housing firm in all of New Jersey. I'm going to apologize and recognize the fact that this has been a very tight timeline for this process, more than we had originally planned on it being when we started this. But we are under the jurisdiction of the courts, the Superior Court of Monmouth County, and they're strictly monitoring this process, and they're looking to bring all of these settlement agreements in line in as expeditious manner as possible. I would ask the public to carefully consider the very detailed information and materials that we presented this evening. When you consider all of the numbers presented, some of them may seem very large for the town the size of Fairhaven. However, please keep in mind that in essence, the borough is talking about the development of 4 affordable housing units. When you also consider the settlements that other municipalities have made in the past few years, including many of our neighbors and other similar towns in Monmouth County, I think you will conclude that Fairhaven's settlement agreement is very well done. There's a public handout. If you don't have it in front of you, it was posted on our website and in many locations. I encourage you to take a copy off the table if you don't have one. I'm going to reference several sections of that. I'm going to start with affordable housing in New Jersey, and I want everyone to keep in mind that this has been an ongoing concern now for 36 years. Early on in the process, the state's larger cities and municipalities with significant open space were the most desirous for affordable housing developers. Fairhaven was somewhat insulated because of both our size and our lack of open space. Throughout the past 36 years, Fairhaven's governing body and planning board members took a cautious and ultimately very prudent approach to the process of affordable housing. The borough has continuously monitored the ongoing legislative and legal affordable housing events. During the same time period, municipalities throughout New Jersey have spent millions of dollars in professional fees, both implementing and litigating affordable housing in their communities. The specific timeline is laid out for you in Fairhaven. You can follow. I'm not going to read it to you. I'm going to give you the highlights to tell you that as the borough prepared for our master plan re-examination in 2015, we knew that the housing element and fair share plan would ultimately have to address a realistic plan for the borough to meet its affordable housing obligations. The desirability of living here in Monmouth County, as well as the increasing value of land in Monmouth County, made it clear that developers were likely to use builders' remedy lawsuits on smaller and smaller tracts of land. For the past 4 years, the borough has utilized a variety of resources to adopt an affordable housing plan that would limit our exposure and control our zoning in a very efficient and cost-effective manner. When you consider what the borough has saved in professional fees through the years, it is worth noting that the timing of this agreement is as close to perfect as it could have been, simply because we have managed to get to this point without having a lawsuit filed against the borough, which would have taken away a town's ability to control our own development, and we did not waste taxpayer dollars on inordinate professional fees. Once this agreement is finally approved by the court, the borough will have effectively insulated itself from any builder's remedy lawsuits through 2025, at which time all municipalities in the state of New Jersey will also be required to review their affordable housing plans. I'm going to ask the audience, please hold all questions to the end of this full presentation, at which time we will take questions and answers from the floor. I'm going to introduce Michael Edwards. He's going to say a few words before he turns to the presentation of the report plans.
Thank you, Lisa. As indicated, my name is Michael Edwards. You guys all hear me? Am I close enough to the mic? Yeah? Okay. My name is Michael Edwards. I'm an affordable housing attorney. I'm at the law firm Resounding, Edwards, and Nolan. We represent municipalities in affordable housing. It's literally all we do. We represent upwards of 70 municipalities, and I individually handle almost 30 of those cases. So before we get into the presentation, I just want to thank you all for coming out tonight and expressing interest in affordable housing. It's obviously very important. These decisions will matter. They will have a lasting impact on the borough. I'd also like to thank the governing body, professionals, and the Mount Laurel Subcommittee, all of whom worked very hard and diligently in this process. They're all very zealous and passionate about the borough of Fairhaven and about you, the residents. These decisions are never easy, they're never popular. The Mount Laurel Doctrine is inherently disruptive, so is inclusionary zoning, so is affordable housing. I know it's particularly frustrating in the context of these post-Mount Laurel for declaratory judgment actions because this is all happening in the context of litigation. These discussions are privileged and confidential. And that's for good reason. There are a lot of inputs, risks, considerations that can be prejudicial in the event that they were made public. It'd be like giving our adversaries a playbook to our vulnerabilities. So, with that being said, however, I would say in 95% of the cases that I handle, that our office handles, the policy decision of the governing body is typically to have this presentation, to the extent that you can have such a presentation, on the night they're going to take action. So many municipalities don't have any kind of public input at all, really, until the settlement is fait accompli, and they're set to vote on it that night. So this is more transparency, really, than is typical in this process. Obviously, the settlements aren't finalized. There's still a bit of horse trading, but we do know the major bones, the structure of the agreement. We do want to share with you, those details to the extent possible in a manner that doesn't prejudice, the borough as we proceed and finalize this document. So against that backdrop, we'll get into the weeds about how we got here, why we're here, what a builder's remedy is, the carrot and stick approach that is the Mount Laurel Doctrine, and some of the major salient terms that you will be seeing in your settlement agreement, and ultimately many of which are already made public by virtue of the March 7, 2019 Housing and Fair Share Plan. To walk you through some of those considerations and documents, I'll present you higher.
Thank you, Mike. My name is Susan Poole. I'm a partner in the planning consulting firm at Howard & Associates. That's Fred Heil over there, sitting there. I'm the one that's making the presentation this evening. And just to follow up on what Mike said, we do appreciate everyone being here. It is so helpful in the process to have the public involved. And I must say that Fairhaven is one of the most transparent communities that we've worked with on affordable housing. And our firm does a lot of affordable housing in terms of planning, and it's really good to see this approach, and we're very pleased to be here. So thank you to all of the borough for this opportunity. We've prepared a PowerPoint, and there's a lot of information on this PowerPoint. Hopefully your heads will explode as we go, as I try to go through it. These highlights. Can you hear me?
It's not good.
Okay, I'll try to talk. Is that better? Okay, great. Raise the mic. I'll probably kill the mic as okay, we have, oh no, you're an attorney. We need the engineer. There we go. Okay, hopefully that will be better. Okay? Yeah, I'll get as close as I can. If I start to kind of pull back, just be able to put your hand up or do whatever, okay? So, starting off with, what is affordable housing? Everybody has an idea, they probably have a conception of what affordable housing is, but what it is a term used for both renter and occupied housing options that are affordable to a diverse range of incomes. Broken down, and I'll get a little bit into what this means, but moderate, low, and very low income. And in New Jersey, those that qualify for affordable housing work in professions that pay good salaries, both in the private and public sector, including police, teachers, tradesmen, and other working families. And there have been a number of studies done that indicate who lives in affordable housing, and this is in fact the case. And just so that you have an idea, a sense as to what we're talking about here is based on the median income of what is called the housing region, which is Mercer, Monmouth, and Ocean counties. Median income is approximately $103,000 for a family of 4. Moderate income, as we talked about, is one of the income categories, is 50 to 80% of median income. So a household of 4 could make $82,000 and be considered moderate. Low income is 30 to 50% of median, which is approximately $51,000, and very low is 30%, below 30% of median, which is approximately $31,000. So it just gives you a pointer of reference. How does that translate in terms of sales prices and rental? Again, we've tried to break down that. A 1-bedroom could be sales anywhere from $127,000 to $154,000. 2-bedroom we have down to $155,000 to $187,000, and 3-bedroom $180,000 to $218,000. In terms of rents, we're also talking about anywhere from 1-bedroom from a low of $580 to 3-bedroom cap at $2,100, and then it staggers within that. We've tried to put together a timeline as to what's been going on with affordable housing in the state of New Jersey over the past number of years. Affordable housing has been something that has been going on since 1975 and what is called Mount Laurel I, when the courts determined that municipalities had a constitutional obligation to address their affordable housing obligations. And then we had 1983, we have Mount Laurel too. And that's when this concept of builder's remedy lawsuit was instituted. Again, this is the court. This is the Supreme Court of New Jersey. And a builder's remedy lawsuit is when a builder can come in and sue a town and say, town, whatever, X town, you have not provided for your fair share of affordable housing, and therefore, we are the white knights. We are going to come in and we are going to provide that affordable housing. But to do that, we're going to bust up your zoning, we're going to ask for increased density, and that's the way we're going to do it. Then we had, in 1985, the New Jersey Fair Housing Act, which created, and this was Mount Laurel 3, created what's called COA, the Council on Affordable Housing. That was the administrative agency within the state that was to address the affordable housing obligations and the rules and regulations. And as you well know, New Jersey loves their rules and regulations no matter what topic it is. In 1986 to 2014, COA was making rules up, they were creating obligations, and then in 2015, they were not really getting where they needed to get, COA, with the rules and regulations and the obligations. The Supreme Court in 2015 disbanded COA. And they basically said they'd become dysfunctional. And they made the trial courts, they said the trial courts will assume what COA was doing for all those years. And so that is why, and they're reviewing, they are approving, they are doing everything that COA was. And so now that's why we're in front of the courts. All municipalities now are in front of the courts. There was a Mount Laurel 5 that spoke about the gap period because there was a time frame where nobody was determining, coming up with obligations, nobody was doing anything. So within that, we have these rounds for the fair share obligation. And again, we have years of this going on. So the first round was 1987 to 1993. The second round was 1993 to 1999. And that has become known as the prior round. That was between 87 and 99. What everybody had, every municipality had an obligation, a number. And then we had the third round that includes this gap period from 1999 to 2025. Okay, that's this third round obligation. So you have the prior round, you have the third round, you have a rehabilitation need, which is generally, although, and that's a present need, that's existing substandard units in a municipality, you don't have it, so you have a zero present need obligation. And all of those together make up the municipality's fair share obligation. Now, as I said, there are always rules and rules and rules and rules. So you don't just say, oh, we're going to deal with our obligation this way. You have certain standards and limitations. You have a certain number of rental units that you have to provide. You have a maximum number of senior units that you can provide. In other words, you can't just do 100% senior. You have a minimum of very low and low-income units that you must provide. You have a minimum of very low-income units that you have to provide, and you have a minimum of family units that you have to provide. Now we get to Fairhaven. So we have a prior round obligation. These are numbers. we have a prior round obligation of 135. We have a third round obligation of 236. We have a zero obligation for rehabilitation, and we have a total fair share obligation of 371. And you're saying, where the heck would we get that? Well, there's a provision in the rules that permit developed municipalities, as Fairhaven is, to ask for a vacant land adjustment. Basically what that says is that Fairhaven doesn't have enough vacant land in order to accommodate that kind of development, okay? And so you can go in and you do an assessment and you determine, okay, what do we have available? What parcels are available for development? And the end result of this process, this vacant land assessment, is a determination of the borough's what's called realistic development potential. It's called RDP, for new affordable units. And an RDP is that portion of the borough's fair share obligation that can realistically be created after accounting for the lack of vacant land, that there's nothing there. The remaining part of the obligation is called the unmet need. The unmet need is that portion of the obligation that cannot realistically be created because of the lack of developable land. So what has Fairhaven been doing? I know that there's been discussion about everything that has been going on, and there's been a lot of activity. Your people have been extremely active. And just briefly, there's been in 2016 a master plan re-examination report, in 2017 an active transportation plan. Between 2018 and March of 2019, the subcommittee for affordable housing has been with the professionals, have been having ongoing meetings to come up with a realistic and formulate a realistic housing element fair share plan. March of 2019, there was a filing of what's called a declaratory complaint with the court. Again, this is part of the process, and it provides immunity from builder's remedy lawsuits. As we talked about, that's when a developer can come in and say, they haven't done anything, the municipality. In March of 2019, the planning board did adopt a housing element fair share plan, which we'll just briefly go through. And then that same month, the governing body endorsed that plan. And subsequent to March of last year, through now, there have been negotiations between the borough, representatives of Fair Share Housing Center, which is a public advocacy group in the state, and M&M Realty, which is an interested party, which is the owner and developer of the Sunoco site. And again, the housing subcommittee has been continuously involved. So the adopted housing plan, and I not want to spend too much time on this because we're moving on to what's occurred through the negotiations. But the March 2019 housing plan, again, had a fair share obligation 371. That hasn't changed. The RDP, realistic development potential, was 1 unit. And the unmet need was 370 units. There were a number of mechanisms that were being used to address the 1 unit RDP, which was through a nonprofit, Habitat for Humanity, as well as overlay zoning, which I'll explain what that is, and an accessory apartment program. This just lays out what that is. Let me go back. The RDP was proposed to be addressed on the DPW site through a municipally sponsored nonprofit housing developer, probably Habitat for Humanity. The remaining unmet need, that 370, was also for the DPW site, as well as overlay zoning and accessory apartment program. Now, overlay zoning, what that means is it allows the existing overlay zoning to remain, but it adds an option for developing what's called inclusionary zoning, which is a mix of the affordable and market housing, residential, through the overlay. For example, in the business district overlay, the existing business zoning standards would continue to apply, but it would give, the overlay would give another option for what would be permitted for future development. This is just a map that shows some of those areas, including the DPW, the Methodist Church, which would be an overlay, and the business zone overlay. Now some of this you'll hear in the next piece of this. So now we move forward to 2020. Here we are, satisfying the obligation. So since 2019 was adopted, again, the borough has entered into negotiations with Fair Share Housing Center, which they're involved in every municipal affordable housing project virtually throughout the state, to determine what ways the borough can satisfy its obligation. Normally, the court appoints a court master, it's a planner who assists in negotiating the settlement agreement and acts as the court's expert. And here we go. What we've done here on this slide is to show what the adopted 2019 housing element is and the elements of that versus the proposed 2020 settlement agreement with Fair Share Housing Center. As you note, the fair share obligation remains the same. The realistic development potential has increased from 1 to 4 because we now have a what's called the M&M site. But in order to address the 4-unit RDP, we have the development of the what's called the Sunoco site, I think everybody knows, as well as Habitat for Humanity site. Those would be 2 units and 2 units. And the unmet need, which is now 367 units, would again be addressed through overlay zoning on the Methodist Church site, overlay zoning on a portion of the business district, an accessory apartment program, and a borough-wide affordable set-aside. The proposed RDP is to create 12 market-rate units on the River Road or M&M site and 2 affordable units for a total of 14 units, as well as M&M would pay $175,000 to Habitat for the creation of 1 very low-income unit. The Habitat site, which would be 100% affordable development, 1 for sale and 1 rental at the corner of Henderson Place and Allen Street. And again, the unmet need would be through the overlay, and there are other mechanisms that would be available. This is just visuals to show, if anyone doesn't know, where the M&M site is. That is an aerial of the M&M site. The Habitat for Humanity site at Henderson, that is an aerial, and a portion of that would be used for a, again, for a sale and rental unit. This is the Methodist Church site. This is supposed to be the business overlay site at 20 units to the acre, but mixed use along the River Road frontage. This is another overlay area within the business district. This is broken down 15 units to the acre to the north of River Road and 20 units to the acre to the south. This includes the municipal complex. I'm going to finish up briefly with this, and then Mike's going to come back up to talk about what are the next steps. Without a court-approved housing plan, the current RDP is 4 units. Instead of complying with the full obligation of potentially 371. The borough does not receive long-term immunity and is open to builders' remedy lawsuits. And if it's determined by a judge that the borough practices what's called exclusionary zoning and has not addressed its obligation, then the judge could give the developer permission to construct high-density inclusionary development anywhere within the borough. And the borough loses control over where and how that development will occur. And lastly, Fairhaven could fight, but would have significant risks and costs, with very little, if any, upside. On that note, I hope everybody can hear me well enough. I'm going to hand this back over to Mike.
Thank you, Susan. And, so that was a lot of information, obviously. I think the key takeaways, or the buzzwords really that help make people conceptualize some of this stuff is the words carrot and stick. It is carrot and stick approach. You heard a bit about 1983 and Mount Laurel 2. When that decision was issued, the courts were flooded with builders' remedy litigation, lawsuits. To curb those lawsuits, the legislature adopted the Fair Housing Act of 1985, which created the Council on Affordable Housing. Ultimately, what the Fair Housing Act structure and Bowen says is, if you comply voluntarily, we'll give you insulation from those remedy lawsuits. If you don't do that, you run the risk of losing losing your home rule abilities to zone for affordable housing via the builder's remedy. So when COAS failed to do its job, starting in 1999 and ending in 2014, and culminating in what's commonly referred to Mount Laurel 4, the Supreme Court relied on the Fair Housing Act in returning primary jurisdiction to the trial courts. Ultimately, we have the same structure now. To the extent you petition the courts voluntarily, which we have, you get insulated protection from builder's remedy. It's currently in the form of temporary immunity. So the borough currently, in the context of declaratory judgment action, enjoys temporary immunity. You will continue to enjoy that immunity so long as you participate in this process in good faith. And ultimately, the goal here is to get immunity until the year 2025. So how does that occur? Assuming that the governing body votes on this on the 27th or the 10th and votes in the affirmative, the next step would be that those settlement agreements, both the development agreement and the Fair Housing Center settlement agreement, would be subject to a fairness hearing, probably in or around March. We'd have a fairness hearing, and the inquiry at the fairness hearing would be, are those settlement agreements fair and reasonable to the interests of the region's low and moderate income households? To the extent that's publicly noticed, things are put on file for 30 days before we can make objections to those settlement agreements. To the extent that the court finds that they're fair and reasonable, you then move on to implementation of the plan and adoption of the plan. So the plan would be amended, the 2019 document would be amended to the 2020 document, which would include all the major salient terms of the Fair Housing Center settlement agreement. In addition to that, you adopt all the zoning ordinances and various kind of pro forma resolutions and ordinances to implement the plan. As to the 4-unit RDP, the borough has a legal obligation to create a realistic opportunity for the construction of those units during the pendency of your plans between now and 2025. As to the unmet need, which again is the portion of the obligation lost through the adjustment process, you have a lesser legal standard, more ill-defined. Basically, you take reasonable efforts to address that. As was kind of presented in the PowerPoint, the chief mechanism for doing that is overlay zoning. Taking the Methodist Church use as an example, that use could remain a church in perpetuity, or a subsequent owner or property or developer could acquire the site and redevelop it in a manner consistent with the overlay. Which, you know, that particular overlay calls for up to 10 units an acre, and at least in senior, at least in the first go. So once you've adopted all of your zoning ordinances and overlay ordinances and various other ordinances and resolutions and documents, spending plans, stuff like that, you'll then be back before the court and you'll be at a compliance hearing. The inquiry this time isn't whether a settlement is fair and reasonable, but rather does the plan create a realistic opportunity for the construction of those units. Again, it's publicly noticed, the housing limit goes on file. To the extent there are any objections, we'll respond to them, we'll offer testimony. At the end of that process, if the court approves your plan, you get a judgment of compliance and repose. That is a shield for you guys from builder's remedy between now and the year 2025. So that's ultimately what we hope to achieve in the context of this litigation. I should also mention, you know, the year 2025, when I first started giving these presentations after Mount Laurel 4, it was 10 years away. Now it's 5. It's not that far away. The good part about complying now is you've taken a look under the hood. You know where all your vacant land is, or lack of vacant land, really. And in 2025, let's say the court's dump another, this is being extreme, I'm not going to do this in all likelihood, but let's say you got strapped with another 1,000 obligation. Well, you're not creating more land, so you'd be going through the same vacant land process again. You'd say, well, between now and 2025, maybe one or two things have changed in terms of circumstance, but your RDP in all likelihood, or hopefully, will be, you know, in or around zero at that time. So you'll adopt a new plan in 2025, probably in all likelihood with less vacant land than you have now. And you'll petition the court again for a JOR between 2025 and 2035. So that's kind of the process moving forward, ideally.
Mike, Susan, Teresa. Can you hear me, son? Can everybody hear me? Okay. Mike, Susan, Teresa, thank you very much. That concludes the presentation. I know it's a tremendous amount of information to absorb all at once. There's a lot of acronyms, a lot of alphabet soup flying around. So now we're going to go to question and answer session. Special Counsel Mike Edwards will field the questions with the assistance of the borough professionals and or officials as needed. Questions are to be asked one person at a time. Please state your name and address clearly so the borough clerk can get it. Please come to the microphone. Please limit your individual time to 3 minutes. Please do not repeat any questions that have previously been asked and answered. And also, if you'd like to make a statement, please do so in the form of a question. We would like to limit the Q&A to 45 minutes if possible. So apparently there's a football game going on, and there's some people that will attend that. But be that as it may, who would like to be first? Sir, please step up to the microphone.
Good evening. Can you hear me? I'm Steve Knowlton, 77 Church Street, Fairhaven. I have one question. If you go back a year or two, there was a plan to reduce the size of the DPW site, and the land behind that reduced site would be then put on the market. So is that part of that land that may be freed up? Is that part of the overlay?
No, it is not. So that is not part of the overlay zone.
So if the town proceeds to try to sell that land because it now no longer needs the entire property for the DPW, is that going to be constrained by fair housing?
That's a good question. So to the extent that there's a parcel in the township that's outside the overlay or that isn't currently being utilized to address RDP, so in other words, it's not used for compliance whatsoever, to To the extent that site becomes vacant, available, suitable, and approvable for affordable housing, it could potentially have an RDP impact. It could increase your RDP if those criteria are met and the site is of sufficient size. So the DPW site or any other site in town should be viewed from that prism before any decisions are made about those types of uses.
Well, just looking at that site, only a portion of it is being used. I guess the DPW ends where the recycling center is, and the rest of it is wooded. I'd like it to stay wooded, but still that would seem to be an obvious situation that should be covered in any kind of protection you're trying to get for the town.
It's been brought up ad nauseum.
Hi. Hi, I'm Jillian Hoagland, 89 Hendrickson. Two questions. First question, we saw in the presentation that originally the two houses were going to be in back of my house on that DPW site, which I think our whole neighborhood was cool with more or less. How did we get from that to the area on Hendrickson and Alvin?
That's a good question. So your plan did initially contemplate that site. There are RDP implications on that site. So the Hendrickson Allen site that's currently proposed in the settlement doesn't have such RDP implications because it's so small that it couldn't fit a unit there in an inclusionary development context. So it goes back to the question that was just asked. Every time you make something available, suitable, and provable, it has an RDP implication. So you're treading water if you generate RDP on something you used to comply with. So that, that's part of the answer. That's not the primary part of the answer. There are a lot of other planning considerations and inputs on the DPW site. The borough wants to maintain flexibility on what to do in the future with that
So
site.
that's the answer. You want more revenue from that. The second question is, now I was told by the family that used to own my property and a lot of older Fairhaven families that have been in town for 100 years, that was given to the town on the condition that it never be built on. Have we looked into this thoroughly, and can you show us the proof?
I would do the title search. I'm not in a position to show you the title search tonight, but yes, we did.
When did you do the title search? Because as of Friday, the council members weren't aware of, really checking it out, what the deed says.
It was done recently.
When?
I didn't do the title search myself.
Okay.
Within the last week or so.
So on Friday, you guys were so great to respond, and I'm so appreciative of that. But you guys just didn't know.
We were told on Monday.
Today.
To answer your question, the title report did come in today, and there are no deed restrictions.
Yeah.
It's the borough owns
That's just like,
Greenfield.
that's Hendrickson folklore?
No, that's Hendrickson folklore. And you made a comment before where it was revenue driven. That's not true, okay? The DPW is being held in abeyance until we thoroughly evaluate that, the process.
And what's the timeline on that?
We don't have a timeline on that yet. We're moving ahead with the DPW, and then we will evaluate the remaining land at that point. The Henderson piece was a piece that's readily available, it's there, and it fit the criteria to be given to Habitat for Humanity.
Right. You understand that for us who live on Hendrickson and Allen, we feel we're under siege. Like, there's so much tumult. We're getting 10 new houses, which is, 20 new cars. Now we're getting 2. Now it's Habitat for Humanity. We just need some kind of understanding of really what's going on. So for you to tell me, I don't know, it's in a bank, we're not sure yet. You don't have it 5 years, 10 years. You have any idea of when that will be developed or?
I apologize, but I can't give you a straight answer on that right now. Again, this is litigation, this is settlement with the courts. I can say right now that the development of the DPW, new facilities going forward, the future of the excess land is not even being considered at this point, okay? We'll be going through the committee process when that happens to discuss what and how that will look. And the Henderson piece is a part of what will be looked at to be developed underneath this agreement.
Right. And any other open land, were there any other plots of land considered?
For this,
For where you want to take over the area that is by our houses? before you chose that, what else was considered?
I believe that was the
The
only
caution that we just don't get into the deliberative process. So I can tell you that, that we had maps upon maps upon maps. We examined the entire tax map of the borough multiple times. So everything was vetted.
Is there a way that we can, these are our houses, this is our community, this isn't like, we knew that the DPW was there, not fight, we knew some things were there. We also knew that this great open piece of property was there where our children play on. It's a very child-dense area. But so between taking away that property, now we don't know what's going on with the DPW. We've still got the 18-wheelers going by. We've got the other, what's it called, around the corner. That was actually an area that, thank you, the grinding station, that was an area that our children used. And when we all bought in that area, that was a selling point and a wonderful thing about our community, to give us 72 hours to, a heads up of, okay, we're going to take it away from you, and to not really be, just feels like you're not being super forthcoming about what other options there are. Just seems like perhaps that was just the easiest option. I mean, is this a pathetic company?
It was the best option, the extent.
Why do you think it's the best option? I feel like you deserve to at least answer that.
Well, no, I'm not going to get into the evaluative or deliberative process that occurred in closed session. But what I can tell you is that everything was vetted, and this was agreed upon parcel based on a number of criteria.
What is that criteria?
Well, so obviously initially it has to be owned and controlled by the borough. It has to be in an appropriate area from a planning perspective.
What
There
is
are legal
appropriate?
considerations as well. Well, so for instance, it's in a single-family residential area. This will look and feel like a single-family.
But it's a two-family.
Correct, but it will look and feel like a single.
But it's in a single-family area. You just said it.
Yes, it is. I mean, the truth of the matter is your affordable housing has to go somewhere, right? So
Right.
this is a broad problem with a number of inputs and considerations. So one of those considerations was instead of having a 10-unit project yield 2 affordable units, right, and potentially have implications on RDP, we needed to get more bang for our buck relative to the RDP versus compliance ratio. And this was
But it's a single-family area by your definition.
it is the largest single family. We do other multifamily in the area, duplex.
What constitutes our area?
Your residential zoning district.
So do you mean on Hendrickson down and we pull those, we call it the WAM section? Are there two families there?
There are several two families in town. They are some more than
Are there? Do you know what streets?
We have a 3-minute time. I'm way over.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions.
Good evening, my name is John Wood, I live at 289 Hans Road. Just wondering if there's anything pending before the planning board on the Sunoco side?
No. So the way this process would work is initially, we'll have a vote on the settlement agreement itself, whether it's the 27th or the 10th of February. Once that is agreed upon, that will include both a settlement with fair share and potentially with M&M, the developer of the Sunoco site. Once that agreement is approved by the board, or even you could adopt the zoning theoretically before the fairness hearing, but in all likelihood, procedurally, the way it plays out is after the agreement itself is approved by the court, we'll then later adopt a zoning ordinance and/or overlay ordinance, which would permit them to develop that site and submit an application pursuant to that ordinance for this overlay.
And that's 14 units, right?
That's a total of 14 units in the mixed-use context.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sarah Fischel. I live at 71 River Lawn Drive, and I'm going to try to make this taller if I can. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to preface my questions with 3 things that influence my thoughts about this. One is that my brother-in-law, when he bought his first house after he graduated from med school, in an affordable housing district in Palo Alto, California. And the people who we're trying to find homes for are our own teachers and doctors coming out of school with giant loans, If you look back at the last 40, 50 years, Fairhaven population is actually down, not up. It's almost flat, but it's kind of down. And that's not true of the population of New Jersey or the population of the United States. And I'm really disturbed that our median home price is well up over $800,000. So I'm kind of motivated to try to figure out how to make this work. But I'm really new to this, and I don't understand this. I have some really content questions. So could you tell me again what I want to know what RDP stands for, but also, like, that's a term that has, that's a term of art that has great weight, and I don't get it. So could you say a few words?
Sure. So in essence, what you're saying is you saw your overall quota was 371 units, right? So forgetting all the categories of need, you have a new construction obligation of 371. You're saying to the court, Judge, I don't have enough land to construct 371 units. Well, what do you have enough land to construct? That's your RDP, or realistic development potential. So that's in the Fair Housing Act itself, and CO has regulations that have evolved over the years to implement that. With respect to your realistic development potential, or RDP, you have a legal obligation to create a realistic opportunity for the construction of that number of affordable units between now and 2025. The rest of it, the 367, unmet need, that's a different standard that's primarily achieved, though not met, through overlay zoning.
Okay. Which brings me to my next question. Could you talk a little bit about what's the pros and cons of doing the overlay zoning versus just rezoning?
Sure, that's a good question. So if you were to just straight up rezone all those sites that we proposed, you render every use currently there a non-conforming use. The benefit of an overlay zone is it gives the property owner the ability to continue that use in perpetuity if he so chooses. But the nice part about it is it also gives him an option to develop in a manner consistent with the overlay.
Why would everybody become a non-conforming use if you rezone?
Well, so to the extent you're changing the zoning to permitted use that isn't currently permitted, so you'd be changing the underlying zoning if you're straight rezoning, unless you already permitted high-density residential over commercial.
Okay, I'm assuming that it's just easier to do an overlay than it is to do a rezone. It's not, yeah.
Largely that's true, and it's the primary mechanism for addressing unmet need as prescribed in the regulations.
Okay, so it's a way that people typically use.
Yes.
And what's the borough-wide affordable set-aside?
Another good question. So the borough-wide set-aside would enable the borough to maintain its ability to say yes or no to high-density residential development. But in the event that somebody came in with a D variance, they wanted to do higher density multifamily development, and the town said yes, they'd have to capture affordable housing set-aside. So if someone came in for an application for 20 units, and the borough said, yeah, you know, that's a pretty good spot for it, we like it, they have to do 4 affordable housing units in the borough, anywhere in the borough where that kind of use was permitted.
I do wonder if some rezoning isn't warranted more broadly in town. We've got a lot of plots of land that have gotten very expensive, and so would we consider going to more density, less than this, but more density in some parts of town in order to allow duplexes, in order to allow 2 3,000 square foot homes on one lot rather than one 6,000 square foot.
So effectively, we are proposing that. So you would never overlay a single-family residential district for density of 6 units or more per acre. It's just something that's typically frowned upon from a planning perspective. And actually, even going back to Mountain Rule 2, they said we won't disturb well-established development patterns like that. However, what we did propose, and we are proposing, is an accessory apartment program, which would allow certain districts that we haven't necessarily decided yet, for a property owner to take a subsidy from the Affordable Housing Trust Fund and do an accessory apartment, over their garage or as a separate building, for the purposes of, affirmatively marketing them to low and moderate income households. So that's the way you would achieve, I think, the goal that you're seeking.
I guess I kind of just don't see where the 2 teacher families are going to live. And I would like for our town to continue to be able to have 2 regular people be part of our town. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Any other questions? Please step forward.
Audrey Henny, 59 Oakland Road. It's just for my sake, I'm just not getting it. What is considered a vacant lot or land?
So the term of art is vacant or underutilized, but that's not the only consideration. First you ask, is it vacant or underutilized? The second question is it available, developable, suitable, and approvable for inclusionary development, meaning ultimately high-density residential with affordable housing component.
So I heard you say all that before, but what I guess I'm still not getting is, so is it public or is it private?
It could be public or private.
Is that where this overlay wording comes into play?
So overlays aren't necessarily over vacant parcels. They're over typically parcels, largely commercial parcels or mixed-use parcels, or shopping centers or malls, or things like of that nature, which instead of those uses, they have the option to do that, continue with their underlying zoning, or then develop something else, a multifamily with an affordable housing component.
Okay, so what I really don't understand, so like M&M developers own the Sunoco area, is that correct?
They are contract purchasers of the Sunoco site, yes.
Okay, then the Methodist Church, is that owned by church people?
That is, yes, they own that site.
And then the one other site that's being considered, I'm sorry, I can't recall it. All of them are considered vacant land.
Yes, so this is a good question. So Hendrickson and Allen is vacant. The Methodist Church and M&M are not. Arguably, the Methodist Church is currently being used as it represents viable use. It's not vacant pursuant to law. That's why we're overlaying it. The Sunoco site fits likely into that category of vacant or underutilized. And in fact, the round one regulations didn't have this concept of unmet need within the definition of vacant or sites primed for redevelopment. Certainly when you have a gas station that's no longer being utilized and a developer who's saying, I'm ready, willing, able on an available, developable, approvable, and suitable site, it's arguably a realistic development potential site. So it's treated as vacant, though in an actual real sense, it's not necessarily vacant.
So those developers, the M&M developers that have the opportunity to do this builder's liability, is that what it's called?
Builder's remedy, they don't have the ability to do that because we petitioned the court voluntarily. Had we not petitioned the court and were we not proceeding on this voluntary track, they could file a petition for builder's remedy which says you're not compliant, you haven't produced any units, you didn't have a plan before we submitted it. In that context, they would submit proposed zoning and a proposed concept plan. To the extent they were able to prove that they were constitutionally non-compliant, that their site was available, developable, suitable, and approvable, it would produce a healthy yield of affordable housing and didn't violate sound land use principles, which is a very, very loose standard pursuant to court decisions. Then they would be entitled to basically their concept plan the way they want it, with very little to no input from the community, from the borough.
Okay, so can they just move on over to the church sites also and have their builder's liability invade that area? Is that
so
possible?
the point of this process is to avoid builder's remedies, right? So they can move on to a different site. Certainly they can acquire any site that they'd like, and to the extent it's in an overlay, they can develop in a manner consistent with the overlay. What they can't do is do something other than the overlay. They couldn't say, for instance, on Methodist Church, which contemplates 10 units an acre, they couldn't say, oh, we're doing 30 units an acre. That's the point. That's what we get out of this process. We get to maintain control of zoning relative to compliance.
Okay, that helps. Thank you.
Ms. Taylor from Main Street. A couple questions. Are the new homes, are they all purchases or some rentals?
So the M&M site would be rental. That's by way of settlement agreement. Outside of that, well, and actually the Habitat for Humanity site in all likelihood will be one for sale and one rental. Outside of that, where you have an overlay zone, we can't dictate tenure in the ordinance itself. So without developer's agreement and an understanding of what they want to do, we can't tell them it has to be rental or it has to be for sale. It has to be either pursuant to your overlay ordinance.
Okay, and then Are you required to build single-family residence or duplexes? Can you not build condos or townhomes?
You could build condos or townhouses, and, certainly at the density of 10 units an acre or 8 units an acre in the Methodist church site, for example, it's very conceivable that's what we would develop as.
Okay, so it's, you're not required single-family residence. It seems to me that would be more logical to build townhomes, since you can build a lot more than single-family residences when you're limited on land. Who owns the M&M? I mean, the M&M owns the gas station, but who owns the land on where the Methodist church is?
The church.
Oh, okay, I thought you said M&M was also.
That's hypothetical, but something else.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Emily Lake, 116 Park Avenue. So, I guess a couple of confusing things I trying to get cleared up. So, the Methodist Church, was it chosen under kind of this broader, is there been interest in the Methodist Church? So, whether it's part of the overlay in this passage, is there a potential sale, like, that's going to pass and then it's going to be purchased?
No, we have such information.
Yep, so, okay, I'm just, like, the Methodist Church is owned by the church, and all of a sudden, this all passes, my thoughts are, like, has there been interest, that it's going to be all of a sudden, it's gonna pass, and then someone's gonna buy it, it's gonna go for sale, and whoop.
We have no reason to believe that, but that being said, it certainly could, right? The secretaries of overlay zoning, obviously the value of the site would change, so it's not
Right.
inconceivable that it would change it.
Right, so it's just more of a, the carrot, but, could that be like the carrot for a developer, like, zoning changes,
It's
what
unique.
we've gone to before to, whoop.
It's unique. So it stands alone. It is not otherwise
What's unique?
immediate, the church site. It's
Okay.
not immediately adjacent to anything else. So there's been some discussion about whether or not you would create these things within other zones, or whether we would subdivide larger zones into smaller ones. The nature of this is disruptive because we didn't do it voluntarily. We didn't ask everybody to come in and say, how should we rezone Fairhaven? We've been forced to do that in order to create a realistic opportunity to develop affordable housing. So the thought process was to develop something that would be most compatible with Fairhaven as it sits today.
Okay.
The Methodist church site sits alone, and it is apparent that it could be developed with some sort of multifamily housing project in a way that would not disrupt other neighborhoods.
Okay. And how many acres is that? Does anyone know? No.
It's 3.5 acres, but it's wide.
Okay.
So it's about 2
It's 5, it's constrained, so it's like 3 net acres and change.
So it's 5 acres?
5 total gross. Developable just over 3 acres.
Okay. And honestly, so there's lots of construction clearly with single-family homes. Is there the option for people who want to potentially, make their lot, if they're planning on tearing down, is to build, double the townhomes side by side? Is that an option for local residents or no?
Outside of the accessory apartment program, which I described earlier, no.
So if someone has a good sized lot, and some of them have built 2 homes with, you can walk down like this, so why can't someone who owns, build a nice, duplex?
Well, so they could build an accessory apartment, and I guess, to a certain extent, there could be a scenario where they may look or feel like one and of the same. So you build an accessory structure that would be affirmatively marketed to low and moderate income households for a period of 10 years or 30.
I guess that's not what my question. So my question is if we're allowing all this redevelopment, elsewhere, why isn't there more say for the development, like in the town, like, new construction versus, there's, beautiful duplexes, so you have an option for 2 families who could potentially afford to live in town versus no families.
Well, so to the extent anyone has such a proposal, there's nothing in our plan or settlement that precludes us from that. I would say it would be very, very unusual compliance technique because you wouldn't be, so the person, the entity who built the duplex would then be renting the additional unit or accessory structure at low and moderate prices, which would have to be permanently marketed to the region in a lottery system for the LMI household. So it would be unusual. Typically, it's not sufficient market incentive, but to the extent some property owner was interested in such a use, they could certainly propose it.
Okay. So, if we're rezoning, do you think we could potentially get rid of picket fences? I was like, since we're kind of jumping into the century, it would be awesome to, grass and picket fences.
Also, let's keep reading 32 Fifth Street. Did I hear something about senior housing?
Yes.
In the future?
Yeah. So one thing that the governing body felt was important was to have some provision for an overlay that at least allowed for senior or age-restricted housing.
And will it be affordable?
Yes, so the current settlement, and actually the Housing and Fair Share Plan, which was adopted in 2018, calls for an overlay on the Methodist church site that would permit up to, I believe, 30 units, 5 or 6 of which would be affordable to low and moderate income age-restricted households.
Yeah, but the Methodist church, what I understand, that's like a pie in the sky. I don't think that they will soon.
Well, I don't have a crystal ball. I have no idea which one of your overlays will be developed. The bottom line is there's something called a senior cap. It's actually in the slideshow. To the extent you want to do senior housing, that would be more likely to develop between now and 2025, which is your realistic development potential. You can only do one such unit. You're capped at 1 unit, 25% of your RDP. So you could have one senior affordable unit pursuant to the regulations. If you couldn't propose, for instance, all 4 of them be done as age-restricted housing.
And then affordable, that would be like $60,000 would be have to grow.
I don't remember the exact, I think it was roughly $102,000 for one person was the upper range. No, that was the median. So it was roughly $80,000 was the upper range for moderate for a person house. Yeah, I don't know the exact number.
Yeah. And for senior, what?
The senior versus family, income qualification is no different.
No different.
Right.
Okay. So, continue on.
Hi, Liz McNeil, 193rd Street. So I just wanted to go back and get a sense of what actually is very specifically being planned. So we've got 2 rental units at the center, is that right? 2?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And are they going to be for families? Are they moderate income, low income? Where do they fit in that?
So they both be family. One would be moderate and one would be low.
Okay. And then on Hendrickson, it's 2 homes, 1 rental, 1 sale. Are they for families?
It would also be family. One would be a moderate for sale unit, and one would be a very low income rental unit.
Okay. Habitat for Humanity is mentioned in the document, but we haven't talked about it yet tonight. Can you tell me a little bit about how they fit into the picture of these units and Hendrickson?
Sure, and without getting into the privilege, the theory is the borough would donate them the land at a nominal price. They have some outside subsidies from the state. The M&M agreement would contemplate some kind of payment also to the facilitation of the unit at the habitat site. So that is the theory for how they work. Right now, it's contemplated that they would have the moderate income family who owns it actually own the entire structure and rent out the very low income unit to generate some form of supplemental income to the moderate income family.
Okay, can you just explain a little bit more? You said something about M&M is going to help fund the Hendrickson site. How does that work?
So, again, without getting into the bones of the settlement to the extent of privilege, I won't discuss amounts, but there is contemplated contribution, financial contribution coming from M&M to help facilitate the affordable housing at that site for habitat.
And then another just more general question. So I read recently that Middletown has pulled itself out of the process of picture housing. Is that correct?
That is.
Can you try to explain that a little bit? I mean, because the bulk of this presentation has been about why it's so important to do it now. And other than, aside from the values and the ethics of making sure that we have affordable housing in town,
the sort of pressure that has been placed upon us for this, right? Is, so what Middletown's pulling out, and they're massive. So,
Well, so I don't represent Middletown, first of all. Second of all, you know, Middletown now, if a developer obtains land in Middletown that's viable, they could sue the town, they could come in with 2, 3, 4 stories of high density residential with the concept plan in that boogeyman builder's remedy context as prohibited. Whether or not, to the extent which there are any such developers in Middletown or viable parcels, I don't know. But in this case, it's a little different because we do know there's a viable parcel, and we do know there's a developer, a very litigious one at that, who the second you withdrew would bring you back into court, except you controlling the narrative and the timeline of compliance, they control compliance. When I said carrot and stick earlier, I meant carrot and stick to get to compliance. You're either getting to compliance with the carrot, which is maintaining your zoning powers, or you're getting there with the stick, which is the builder's remedy, which ends in the same JOR compliant plan. It's just a question of whether or not the court's using remedies for non-compliant prescribed alcohol to begin with.
so you're contemplating that Middletown is pulled out because they are just accepting the builder's remedy?
They're accepting the risk of the builder's remedy.
Right. Any thoughts as to why they're willing to accept that risk at this juncture?
I don't want to speculate on it, but I would imagine they don't feel threatened by too many parcels being built.
Okay. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Linda Lisa at 111 Grange, and I have a follow-up question for the Smith property. All right, if I'm reading this correctly and understanding some other questions that have been asked. So this is a 14-unit rental property and then 2 other units and then a ground floor commercial property. Is that correct?
No, it's 14 total units, 12 of which would be market, 2 of which would be affordable. Then there'd be ground floor, non-commercial. Yes.
Okay, so where is all the parking for all this going to take place on that site? Because my vision of what that property is right now, I can't in my mind figure out where everybody's gonna go.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it was certainly something that was talked about ad nauseum. I can say, you know, that what is contemplated now to alleviate that is an overhang of tandem parking. So that was something that went round and round and round until we made the most efficient possible parking use that we could come up with, and that was with your planners, your engineers, your Mount Royal subcommittee, and the developer trying to come up and create a solution to account for that parking issue that you have there.
Okay, because there is parking problems already at a property at 612 River Road, and I'm thinking, well, how's this all going to work? But if that's been taken into consideration, that's terrific.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening. Al Sager, I live at 55 McCarter Avenue. I just have one question. The Methodist church site, does that include the minister's house, which is on McCarter Avenue?
I believe that it does. Yes.
It does.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
What's the time frame for the bill?
Sorry?
The time frame
For which?
to start the Habitat for Humanity very low income 2-family home in our single family area? When are we starting that?
So again, assuming that this gets voted upon on January 27th or February 10th, excuse me, there'll be a 4 or 5 month period in between. Well, I'm sorry, there'll be a 2-month delay to the fairness hearing, give or take. Then there'll be 4 or 5 months for implementation of your plan. To make any municipally sponsored program like Habitat for Humanity viable, they need both a construction schedule and a pro forma as part of compliance. So you'd adopt the zoning in that 4 or 5 month window in between the fairness and compliance. They submit an application, or they could submit an application. They likely wouldn't. But the pro forma and timeline for construction would have to demonstrate that they could be under construction, shovel and dirt within 2 years of the judgment of compliance proposed. So, sketching that out 2 years and 8 months from now would be the timeline.
What's the average time on a Habitat build?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Do you guys know? No. What we're doing?
Recognize the citizen.
Hi, Tara Jordan, I live in Rustic Terrace. I just have some questions. I'm confused about how would the borough obtain like the Methodist land? Would they do it through eminent domain? Would they would they have to purchase from Methodist?
They don't have to, so just to be clear, they would never, it'd be unlikely that they would acquire the parcel in any scenario. So what, the way an overlay could work in the theoretical context would be that the Methodist Church sells it to a developer who then would have the ability to construct the proposed project consistent with the overlay zone.
So that kind of leads into my next question. I guess what I'm kind of confused about is what exactly the overlay is. Like from what I'm gathering, like out of the 371, we're only really technically doing 4.
You're creating a realistic opportunity for 4 because that's all that you're land. That's all that you can actually create a realistic opportunity for.
But for the future, you want to do these overlays of mixed use just in case that needs to be done. So it might never happen.
Yeah, so.
Is that,
so
am I right here? I'm just confused what overlay exactly.
Sure, no, that's a fair question. So you have your RDP of 4 and the rest of your obligation. You know, according to the Constitution, if you also, let's back up. The 371, a large chunk of that is already defined, set in the books by cover. The other component of it was the result of a 41-day trial where we all thought about this and spit out a number. So your quota is 371, assuming that's correct and that's what we settle on. You really need the number with very little benefit to the borough.
I mean, 371 and 4 is so different. I'm just surprised that that's what we're ending up.
Well, so the way you do that is you take a map, you see all the vacant parcels in town. You then run through the filter of are they big enough to produce 1 unit of affordable housing in the event it had inclusionary zoning on the site. To the extent that they are, you then ask, is it available, developable, approvable, suitable for affordable housing? If it's not, you take it off the map. You let them 3 or 4 parcels, whatever that number is, you apply density to it, you assume a 20% set aside, and that's your RDP. So there's very little vacant land in town, so your number is very good. The rest of it, the 367, which is obviously the majority of your obligation, is quote unquote unmet need. Because you can't create a realistic opportunity for it, the code standards and requirements for that are more nebulous, more like a reasonable effort towards addressing that component of your obligation. In the context of Mount Laurel 4, certainly post Mount Laurel 4 DJ actions that's primarily achieved with overlay zoning. So an overlay gives an opportunity for that to occur in the future in the event of redevelopment.
Okay, thank you.
Gene DeFalco, 37 Harvard Road. Question, can you answer again about the M&M site? Is that 14 units, 2 affordable, and then what's below specifically?
So the 2019 housing on fair share plan that we adopted contemplated mixed use of 20 units an acre. That site's roughly 0.7 acres and change. So that spits out 14 total units, of which 2 will be affordable, and you have ground floor non-residential uses.
What is that ground floor non-residential?
So it could be a coffee shop, it could be coffee shops, it could be professional offices, it could be a restaurant, things of that nature. We can't dictate what it would be.
Understand. Next question. Is there any consideration with the traffic? I know there's a parking question. With traffic as to where you're coming in or coming out, is this too early to discuss? And is there any consideration for putting a light at that corner of Cedar and River?
So I don't know that we've gotten into the nitty-gritty about where lights might go as a result of this process. Certainly that's something that we consider. Traffic has to come up. To a certain extent, it's a very difficult variable to control this process because of the legal requirements to get where we need to get to.
Okay. And thirdly, is there any tax relief for this particular project and future projects considered?
That's a good question. So it is not envisioned that this project will get, when you say this project, I assume you mean M&M. Yeah, there's no pilot contemplated in the current iteration itself.
Could it be considered?
It is not considered, it hasn't been negotiated, it hasn't been discussed.
Great, thank you.
We sent 39 Lake Avenue. What was your name again?
Mike Edwards.
Was there any thought given to the impact to the schools?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's one that I get at every single municipality I have. Again, I would say that this is the only settlement I've seen. I'm not saying that means it's the only one in the state, but it's the only settlement I've seen where there's a senior overlay, an age-restricted overlay, at least in the first instance. There is an opportunity potentially for that to default to a family overlay in the future in the event that the senior is not viable. However, so that was the first way of mitigating it. The second thing I would say is I don't want to use the word, well, I would say it's not the most compelling argument to make to the courts, because part of the predicate for the doctrine is to give the families that opportunity to get into a good school system. So it's a very weak defense
I
consideration.
understand that, but we just passed $15 million referendum, and I was just wondering if this was taken into consideration. More housing, more people.
Yeah, it's certainly concerned the borough. Again, it's just not the most compelling thing, so advising the borough, I'd want to say that, there are very few things you can do to mitigate that impact. And one of them is the fact that you are doing, between now and 2025, 4 of your otherwise 371 units, because you have the benefit of the lack of developable land.
Okay, one more question. I think I heard Mr. DeFalco talk about taxes. I assume that these areas will have a different tax rate than
I'm not a tax expert, but I can say is that the ground floor retail will obviously have a rateable that doesn't, it goes to your concern you were raising earlier. So if it were purely residential, you wouldn't get the commercial ratables to help kind of mitigate the impact on your schools for the inclusionary development, which will have an impact.
Thank you.
Jennifer Spitz, 26 William. I have a question about the property at Hendrickson Lane. It's a 2-family house. It'll be owned by the moderate income family, and they'll be responsible for renting out the other unit, correct? Are we placing an unfair burden on a family that they have to want to be a landlord to be able to be in here, right? So if they have to own the whole thing and then rent out the other, we're putting extra stipulations on a house that we're now trying to make available to people that may not want to be in a position to rent things out. Have you thought about another solution for this property that doesn't make somebody a homeowner and a landlord when they may not want to be or be in a position to be a landlord and take on that extra responsibility?
So 2 things. First of all, you'll have as part of this process, you have to do an ordinance appointing an administrative agent. Administrative agent will help with things like affirmative marketing, doing the credit check for the potential tenant, and things of those nature, and otherwise vetting the potential tenant. The second thing is, that is the current theory that we think works in talking to Habitat. We have to make this viable for Habitat as well, but that's not necessarily set in stone. So certainly that is a consideration, and we're talking through those details, but the current theory is that the property owner would be the landlord as well.
Yeah, I just look at it as myself, if I were in that position, I might not want to also be a landlord, but I still might want to take advantage of an affordable housing unit within town. And so is there a better way to do this? I'm posing back, is there a better way to do this where we may get 2 units that are available to people to own or manage themselves versus making somebody take on the burden of being a landlord when they may not want that?
We appreciate that perspective, sir.
Me again, Ms. McNeil, 103rd Street. So my understanding of what an overlay means is that on the occasion of the sale of the property, then it becomes, even this is my question, is it then required to be built as moderate low-income housing, or is it an opportunity to be built as moderate, similar to how the commercial zoning works, where it's commercial, but you don't have to build a commercial structure?
No, it's a good question, and the latter is correct. It's an opportunity. So to the extent you had a Walmart in town and it was overlaid, and Target bought it, and they wanted to, build a Target consistent with the current zoning, and they didn't want to do the development in a manner consistent with the overlay or the inclusionary project, they could do that. They still have the rights currently in their underlying zoning, but it is an opportunity for that potential purchaser to develop it in a manner consistent with the overlay.
Okay, so say if someone bought 3 of these properties on Foreman, and then they decided to build, they wouldn't necessarily have to build commercial and apartments above it, or they would?
They wouldn't necessarily have to. So I think that zoning would permit a single family and also just straight retail. So they could do that theoretically. They could develop something that's consistent with the underlying zoning in perpetuity until you change the underlying zoning.
Okay, and then I think one thing I've lost, does all of the construction that we're discussing on Hendrickson Avenue have to take place prior to 2025? The construction?
Yes.
It does.
Yes.
If the people moved in?
I'm sorry?
I think she's asking, do people have to be living there by 2025?
Well, so the legal standard, and all you can do to a certain extent as a borough is create zoning that creates realistic opportunity. So you have to create zoning that creates realistic opportunity for the development of those projects between now and 2025.
Okay, so they don't, the construction doesn't have to be complete by 2025.
Well, in 2025, right, to the extent somebody came around again, and they said, well, we know it doesn't create realistic opportunity because it's not developed. So we don't have to speculate as to whether it creates realistic opportunity. We know in real time. So if you find yourself in July of 2025 and nothing's been constructed, the argument of a potential developer would be, well, you didn't create the requisite realistic opportunity because it didn't get constructed.
And then can somebody speak to the construction timeline, given what you're just saying, vis-a-vis the school construction timeline? I mean, my understanding is that that's about to happen this summer.
We probably won't have a fully baked plan accepted by the court until later this year.
Okay.
So there will be lag time.
You mean there's going to be time between when the school construction is finished and when this construction would start? Okay, great, thank you.
Happy New Year, everybody. Diane Lavora, Madison Catholic. First of all, is it determined that the M&M property is going to be retail on the bottom? Is that set in stone?
Well, so that's what your overlay contemplates. That's what it contemplated in 2019. Certainly, the vision is that anything fronting on River Road would require that downtown non-residential use.
So, if you look at the M&M property, the property right next door is a two-family house. And I think for the feel of Fairhaven, and I've said this to the council before, I think that apartment complex resembled more of the feel of the house next door, especially in a time where we have empty spots at the Acme Plaza, brick and mortar is going out. I think it's only smart to make it look more like the two-family house next door than to put more brick and mortar in our very small town. So is there a possibility that that could switch over, or is M&M contingent on that?
Well, so again, without getting into the deliberative process, I can say that something that was important to the borough was to have that downtown feel to it, walk downtown, and to maintain some of its ratables, its tax base. So the current vision and all the planning documents support, certainly the current duration of the settlement requires that the ground floor be rezoned.
So, just so I understand, our council made that the necessity of that space?
It's in your 2019 Housing and Fair Share Plan that was adopted by the planning board and endorsed by the governing body, yes.
Okay. The DPW, what size are those two lots that are being given to Habitat?
The DPW, we're not using for Habitat anymore. There are 2 or 3 lots.
I mean that strip of property. So what size is that property that will be given to Habitat?
Oh.
50 by 100. The lot to be provided to Habitat will be a lot no smaller than 50 by 100, which is a conforming R5 lot.
Okay. And then, so we still have 9 lots at the DPW that we have extra after we do the construction of the DPW? Is that
It's currently being utilized.
right? But we're starting the construction on the DPW.
No.
We were moving ahead with the development of the new DPW facility. The vacant land to the south is not being considered at this time. A concept plan was developed, I think we had at one time 9 and perhaps 8 and 7, but it's still, as it sits today, one piece of vacant land.
Okay. And then to my last question, with the 4 units that we have and the breakdown that was given about, moderate and seniors, can we pick what, of those 4 units, can we pick that one of them is for seniors? Of all the things, like what if the single family house went to a senior who could actually get income from rent? Like if we choose that becomes a senior house?
Well, so you can't with respect to M&M, and also, so you have micro requirements with respect to very low as well, right? So your very low, which is a Habitat unit, would have to be family, which would be the only potential option as the moderate for sale before. They've expressed no interest, and they've expressed no business model, any ability to do that.
So M&M, in their discussion, they didn't want a very low in their unit, is that what you said?
I don't know that that's accurate. It just ended up working out best for all entities involved, that it be a payment in lieu of the very low income.
So of those 4 units that we have, are any of them going to be for a senior?
No, not as it's currently proposed.
Thank you.
Mike, would be fair to say, so folks, just so you understand when it comes to affordable housing, the owner of the property does not determine who rents the property. It's firmly marketed by a separate agency. It's advertised within a specific area. Then a lottery system is established. So if you're to do an apartment on your property, the borough will give you a piece of portion of money to pay for that, but then you would have or be given your tenant by this other agency and told them you can rent it for 10 years. So the same thing happened with M&M, and the same thing will happen with Habitat for Humanity. They have no control over who gets it. That's done by a separate outside agency that we hire.
Can I address the senior housing piece? Mike said it earlier, it may have gotten lost because there was a lot of information conveyed earlier. Almost no fair share housing plans that go before the court have any senior components to it. And so ours is unique.
No, so what I said was no, I have seen very few, if any, have senior overlays. Some have senior housing, but not when the RDP is 4. When the RDP is close to 100, it becomes more viable to have those types of uses.
Right. So I have an overlay question, which is why I jumped out that way. So I live in the overlay section. How does that change me? I mean, does that mean if I wanted to put a garage apartment, it would have to be for low income, and that's the only stipulation because I'm in the overlay, whereas I'm not allowed to do a garage apartment now?
So you can do anything that your current zone, it's almost as if none of this is happening, you can do whatever you want pursuant to your current zone. It can only never be a detriment to you, it can only be a benefit to the extent you then sell it or you want to develop it, and then, so the overlay, you have that option, that flexibility, and that benefit. But it doesn't impact anything else, it doesn't permit you to do an accessory use that you're not otherwise permitted to do to the underlying zone.
So because it's an overlay, that means that it can be more condensed housing, right? So I could take my lot and make it a 4 apartment building, is that what I'm getting?
Well, so
even though that doesn't exist now, but now I have an overlay that has new rules.
Yeah, so I don't know, the nature of your site, but if your site was in an overlay and it otherwise qualified for you to develop it in a manner consistent with the overlay, I don't know how else to explain.
We're not talking about developing individual single-family homes as apartment buildings. You would need to have a minimum size, and you would need to meet the zoning standards, which we haven't yet developed. And with regard to the apartments, we're not putting apartments. We haven't figured out exactly how we're doing it yet. But the idea is you can't just put an apartment just anywhere. People that did comply with the program would have to submit the apartment into the affordable housing process, which means that you would have to put it into a lottery. You don't get to pick who you want to be there. They tell you who's coming in. And then those apartments would be funded in part with a grant that would be set up through this process and the ordinances, and it would go where we think it's appropriate based on the overall zoning in Fairhaven.
So basically, the overlay area in which I live doesn't change or affect me at all unless Fairhaven wanted to purchase property or unless I wanted to do something. Otherwise, all else remains the same for the zoning aspect.
So let me clarify a few things. First of all, you don't need to sell your house in order for this zoning to be applicable to you. It's applicable to everybody once we adopt the plan, the ordinances, and implement it. So there's no transfer required. It doesn't affect you. Fairhaven is not talking about purchasing any of this property. This is the opportunity to settle with the court to give them an understanding of how we have complied with the spirit of the ordinances, providing the opportunity to develop if the market forces meet the opportunities that arise as a result of properties in Fairhaven turning over. Yours could be on the market and could become part of something. Only you will know that.
So So basically, the overlay is telling the courts, this is where we can fit 357, possibly somewhere down the line. Or more, as, these are where we can find more numbers. Is that-
More affordable housing, you don't need to meet your unmet needs. So the idea that you have to have sufficient overlay that would generate your 367 in a theoretical context, you don't have to do that to comply. You have to take reasonable measures towards your unmet need, one of which is an overlay, which I understand your property read in. When you sold that, somebody could assemble it and have a large enough lot where it otherwise qualify to be developed. You may have this with the overlay, they have that option, or they can maintain the underlying zoning and develop that. This gentleman's been raising his hand for a while.
With something is affordable housing, designated affordable housing, how many years does that restriction apply to the property?
That's a good question. So typically it's 30 years.
30?
30, yes. For the accessory apartments, it's a minimum of 10. That's a little unique, but typically, and generally speaking, it's a 30-year restriction, at least 30 years.
And the second question is quite different than just what I said. Is you were saying the DPW project is going forward. The funding, where's the funding coming? The money coming to pay for that?
So the DPW site is no longer being utilized. It's Hendrickson and Allen, which will be the Habitat site. That is going to be funded through some outside subsidies from the state, a land contribution from the borough, and from a payment in lieu from developers.
That I understand, but I thought the new DPW building has been conceptualized and you're moving forward to building that building. So where's the money coming for that building?
That's outside the scope of this presentation, but I will tell you that the final determination on that has not been made, and the borough hasn't even put that project out to bid and finalize it yet. So ultimately, if and when that happens, the funding sources for that will be part of that presentation of probably the governing body competence.
Susan Harbison, 52 Tyson Drive. I have really more of an observation, and that is that while we're here talking about adding the affordable housing units in Fairhaven, we are every day practically losing somewhat affordable housing. When we moved here 33 years ago, we chose Fairhaven partly because it had diversity in the schools, it had basically mixed income population. And that really it exists to some extent, but we're losing it, I think, each year. As I take a walk, I see neighborhoods changing over. And I appreciate everything Borough Council, Planning Board, Zoning Board does, but I just wanted to comment that if there are any more creative ways we can find to keep what is now affordable housing so that we can maybe have children who can afford to move here and senior citizens on fixed incomes who can afford to stay here, whether it be through our taxing or our zoning rules or something. I think it really is changing the town we live in. Thank you.
Sarah Fischel again, 71 River Run. So you said something that was really interesting to me. So when we get past the 4-unit thing and our total amount that we're supposed to be striving for is 371. But when we submit a plan for that, or the overlay and the accessory apartments, et cetera, what is the state, what is likely to be considered realistic for, like how good does our plan have to be towards getting to that 470 odd units? Because that is a scary number.
Yeah, no, so there's no magic formula there. When we adopted our Housing Up Fair Share Plan in 2019, we adopted it trying to get to something that was defensible and legitimate in court. We knew when we did that fair share would ask for a few more things. So to a certain extent, it's a gray area. What will pass in one community in one town may not pass in another. another. All you can do is make reasonable efforts towards capturing your unmet need. We've identified the areas that are most appropriate for overlay zoning, and we've overlaid them. So we feel pretty good that the plan we have now is constitutionally compliant. We have Fair Share Housing Center endorsing it. So with them on our team, I know there's been one instance where Fair Share has settled the case, and the court said, no, that's not fair and reasonable. They're zealous housing advocates. To the extent they're agreeing to it, it passes constitutional muster as a general proposition.
Thank you.
So let me, I want to just throw a couple more things out. The 2 questions ago with regard to single-family homes and making them more affordable, you know, Fairhaven has changed a lot since many of us have lived here and in the surrounding area. And, you know, housing prices go up. And there's not a lot that this process does or that we can do to affect what somebody's house is worth. So I don't know that it's a negative that people want to be here, and that when people put their houses on the market, they're willing to pay numbers that sometimes surprise people that are from outside of Fairhaven. One of the things that we could have done in order to satisfy this court-mandated process was to take individual homes and to subsidize them to make them affordable. But the problem is that that's incredibly expensive. And so the balance that the committee and the council had to figure out was how to meet the court's requirements in a way that was affordable to the taxpayers, in a way that didn't disrupt everything that is Fairhaven today. Because as I mentioned earlier, it's not like everybody's coming to zoning board meetings, planning board meetings, and council meetings and saying we need to rezone Fairhaven for multifamily housing. We need more apartments. The truth is that people think about it and we talk about it. It's certainly come up over the years. But this process is imposed. So that balance is what we tried to strike, and Mike just spoke to trying to come up with a plan that was viable. The committee originally presented a plan to the council and to the planning board, which they thought was going to work, which they thought that the court was going to accept. Because if the court didn't accept it, then the court would tell us to go back to the drawing board, and the density of 20 per acre would be increased to 30 or 40. And so when we have questions about parking on the Sunoco site at 20, imagine 40. So that's the balance that we tried to strike throughout this process. And nothing is perfect, and a lot of it's a work in progress. But speaking on behalf of the committee, we're very pleased with where we wound up. And while we think that this does mean that things in Fairhaven are going to change and that some development will be different than we had originally intended, if you look at what we currently permit in the zones that are being overlaid against what we will permit after the overlays are in place, they're actually not very different. And the best example I can give is with regard to height. So in the commercial district, we permit 35 feet for commercial buildings in the business district. We agreed to allow 38 feet because our planners wisely told us that if we didn't, that we would not have a viable first floor commercial and 2 floors of residential above it. So to offset it, we're going to push the 3rd story back so that you're going to wind up with a greater setback for the building at the top, so that we figured out a way to try and make it as compatible as we possibly could. The rest of the zoning standards are not yet in place, so we need to continue to work at it. But if you look around downtown Fairhaven and the way buildings have developed over time, it's a hodgepodge, and that's the best thing I could say about it in terms of the consistency of the zoning. So we need to figure out how all this is going to work, marrying the parking requirements, marrying the obligations that we have to the court, and honoring the obligation that's being imposed on Fairhaven to do the right thing. So a lot of this is still out in the open, but I just wanted to sort of put that on top of some of this, because that was the process that we worked through that got us here tonight.
So my question had to do with the overlay. If the plan is approved, is the overlay then automatically approved? Does that zoning change happen and the overlay then exists? And then what, if that is the case, what can be built as of right in the overlay? So it's like 2 parts to that question. If this plan is approved, then does the overlay immediately kick in?
So initially, the overlay is separate or technically from the plan. So you adopt the plan and you adopt the overlay as 2 separate actions. You adopt the plan as a planning board, you adopt the overlay as a governing body with a recommendation from the planning board after it's done. So introduction, planning board, adoption. Once you've done all those steps and a variety of other steps between fairness and compliance, then it goes for court approval. At that point, yes, the overlay ordinances would be operative. Someone could submit an application pursuant to those overlay zones.
So it's conceptual at first?
Yes, right now, the zoning is not in place right now.
And then as of right, if the overlay is in fact
I'm just trying to get my head around what it could look like. It sounds like obviously mixed-use development. You're envisioning retail and then apartments above possibly. I'm just trying to, there are obviously a lot of deep lots and I would think some of these areas would be overlay.
Yes.
Just trying to envision what you're looking for.
If I may, if you want to see a general concept, the new development near Monmouth Park Racetrack, right across the street, it's got some colonial red metal bed on it. It's got commercial on the first floor and then 2 apartments, 2 floors of apartments above it. That's kind of a general design concept that you may see way up to the development.
The last question I have, how many municipalities have put into or approved an affordable plan? How often has this happened in New Jersey?
Yeah. So initially there were over 300 municipalities that petitioned in declaratory judgment action, a declaratory judgment action pursuant to Mount Royal 4. I think upwards of 200, maybe even closer to 250 now municipalities have settled, and they're in various points of the settlement being approved, the plan being adopted, the JOR being issued. So roughly half the municipalities participate in this process. And typically, they're ones that are more vulnerable and attractive from a zoning perspective.
Thank you.
What was your name, ma'am?
Karen O'Shea.
Hi. Todd, you're very articulate and you really clear up a lot of things. But I just wanted to mention one thing. With 35 feet in the business district, in the overlay area, if you look, and 3 stories of the M&M apartment building, if you just stand in the Krauser's parking lot, you have a 2-family house on your left that's 2 stories, and you have the commercial building across Cedar Avenue, which is white, and I don't think that comes anywhere as near 35 feet. I think that's much lower than what's allowed in that area. So now you're going to take this apartment building and build it, that much higher, and 3 floors, as opposed to, I'm just asking, don't know if we can change it, get rid of the brick and mortar and put the apartments on the bottom. Maybe even elderly people could rent those or buy those apartments, and then it looks, because that commercial property I'm talking about on Cedar and River Road looks like a house. It's white. There's a house to the left. Instead of putting more brick and mortar in Fairhaven, which might ultimately just be empty, to make it look like the 2 buildings on the left that aren't nearly 35 to 40.
So, look, clearly it's going to be a really big change because Sunoco's been a parking lot for an awful long time. It was virtually a parking lot when it was open, right?
No,
So having...
He did a very good business when he was open.
It was a small building. It was just a little building in the back. So it will be a dramatic change. There's no question about that. And there's nothing we can do about it. And I think that it's important that when you think about what we're going to do in the future, that you recognize that the existing zoning is locked in as a matter of right. And if you own a piece of property, you are entitled to do what the zoning says that you can do. And while it might be nice to think about how best to help people, how best to help seniors, the market drives those things. And so you are free, I am free, Costa's free to buy a piece of property, to take less money and to rent it just to people that don't have as much money. But that generally isn't the way it works. So what will happen is that the market's going to dictate it. We're going to do the best we can to contain it in a way that is compatible. The building you're talking about...
But I need to interject here, because M&M didn't insist on retail space on the bottom. You guys insisted on retail space on the bottom. And this is where I'm trying to just give you a different viewing point. So if M&M, who own that property, wants to put retail, that's one thing. But my council is insisting on brick and mortar and making it obtrusively larger than the 2 buildings on each side. That's all I'm saying.
I really understand you've never been in 3 times, so, but we really appreciate the point of view and your contribution.
Thank you.
Any other questions? We're coming up on the 9 o'clock mark. Certainly like to call adjournment. Seeing none.
Sorry, I just really easy. Is the borough gonna, I'm sorry.
Please come on over.
Sherry D'Angelo, 36 Sands Road. I just want to know if the borough is going to put this presentation up on its website.
Yeah, I believe
Yes.
Yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Sherry. All right. See any other questions? Motion to adjourn. I'd like to
Thank you all.
You're quite welcome. Thank you all for coming. We really had some great questions and perspectives. And we have to vote. Motion to adjourn. All in favor? Folks, thank you very much for coming out. We really appreciate it.